Although the January transfer window is 15 years old this month, that's only in the Premier League. Mere mortals who existed outside the elite in 2003 managed to struggle on for another 3 years before the restrictions on when to buy and sell players was extended to further down the football pyramid, and as such, City have only been involved in the mad scramble at the beginning of each calendar year since 2006. Most of the players we've signed in January during this period have been loanees, or were already at the club as loanees prior to a permanent move. But of those that walked through the door fresh as a daisy in January, not yet burdened by the cynicism and underachievement of Hull City AFC, we've plucked out 5. 1. John Parkin. Despite everything that has gone down at the Circle in the last dozen years in terms of big occasions, promotions, finals, continental delights, subsequent falls from grace and, of course, major signings, the most famous January acquisition we've ever made, certainly among longer-serving City fans, is still probably the rotund, risible Macclesfield striker on whom Peter Taylor splurged £150,000 in January 2006. There was little doubt at the time that City, a fledgling side in the second tier after nearly 15 years away, were struggling for a regular goal-scoring outlet, although wide on the left Stuart Elliott, against more brutal defences than had been used to, was doing what he could. Billy Painter had arrived on loan and was bumbling along, unaware of his new surroundings, though Taylor made permanent his arrival in January too, while Ben Berger was still not match fit after a long-term injury and Danny Allsop had been allowed to go home to Australia. Taylor picked up the nippy Darryl Duffy when the window opened, a free scorer in his native Scotland, but he was an unknown here and reaction was minimal. Within us, Parkin had also come through the door and the floodgates opened as aghast City fans remembered how ineffective, cumbersome and generally useless he had been when facing us in the colours of both York and Macclesfield. Yet immediately, Parkin was magnificent. For such an unathletic figure, he had a marvellous touch, with a sublime debut goal at home to Crystal Palace and a stunning Cruyff turn and finish at Stoke before January was over, quickly showing up the doubters. He not only kept scoring but he was also performing. His best team display was at Leicester, even though he didn't score and City lost 3-2 right through until a memorable winner against Leeds in April 2006 that gave us our first win over the stained enemy in almost 20 years. As City clambered clear of the drop, Parkin ended the campaign out of the spotlight, his work done. The tide turned in the close season when he reported for training quite substantially overweight, with City unable to find a shirt to fit him properly, and he was never properly convincing again either in aptitude or attitude, despite 2 goals against Sheffield Wednesday that earned City a long overdue first home win of the season in 2006-07 and a first ever win on live television. His last act of consequence at City was a penalty at Middlesbrough in a memorable FA Cup third-round replay in January 2007, by which time Phil Brown had taken over from the overawed Phil Parkinson as manager and allowed the unprofessional slob that Parkin had become to join divisional rival Stoke on loan. Naturally, Parkin was a success there for a short time, before being recalled at the end of the season in an injury crisis and having to play against Stoke on the patch, something which angered him and, by dint of his savagely cavalier attitude on the pitch, angered City fans even more. Brown sold him to Stoke with barely a look back that summer. He bummed around an array of lower league clubs after Stoke saw through him even quicker than we did, and remains in the league today as a 36-year-old squad player with Newport. In his career he has been sent out on loan 8 times and been handed 4 free transfers, a sure sign that his attitude was always an issue where his talent was not. Despite only 18 months at the club, Parkins was one of the most incident-packed, infamous careers at City of the modern era. 2. Nikita Jelavic and Shane Long. They have to come as a pair, because in January 2014 we had the usual goal-scoring problems that top-flight football brings to 75% of the clubs in it, especially newbies like City. Yannick Sagbo wasn't good enough and Son Aluko was rarely interested enough, while Matty Fryatt found that the ferocious pace of Premier League football wasn't an ideal setting to make one's return from a long-term injury. The likes of Nick Proschwitz and Aaron McLean had long been ruled out of providing any top-tier usefulness. Serious money on serious talent needed to be invested. Steve Bruce cleverly went to Jelavic, out of favour at Everton but absolutely proven at the very highest level, as he knew the Croatian would be desperate for first-team football in order to make his country's squad for the World Cup that summer. 2 days after clinching his signature for £6.5 million, the manager then dished out £7 million to West Bromwich Albion in order to put sheer pace alongside Jelavic's predatory instincts in the shape of Irish striker Shane Long. The duo caused enough problems over the second half of the season to up City's game, with 4 goals each, a reasonably healthy return for a side that didn't create a vast number of goal-scoring opportunities per match. Yet their exploits were largely forgotten thanks to an FA Cup run for which both were ineligible, allowing McLean and Proschwitz round 3, Friat round 4, quarter-final, semi-final and Sagbo round 5, semi-final to score the goals that took City all the way to the final. Long stayed until just after City's debut in Europe, playing in both legs against Trenčín before joining Southampton for an inexplicable £12 million before the Premier League season began. His reputation for diving to win penalties had begun to grate with City fans, even though he was quite often successful in doing so. Meanwhile, Jelavic went to the World Cup, adding his name to the very short list of City players to take part in the tournament, but once it was over, his attitude to the club that hugely aided his prospects visibly deteriorated, despite 8 goals in the relegation season that followed. After 4 games and 1 goal in the Championship, he joined West Ham for £2.8 million, starting just 1 Premier League game for them, prior to disappearing 6 months later to take the money in China. 3. Jimmy Bullard signed in a blaze of publicity in January 2009. It was undeniably a seriously exciting deal. But the lack of outrage from Fulham fans suggested darker stuff surrounded the chirpy, scampering and ludicrously talented midfielder, mainly to do with the condition of his knees. Whatever actually happened at his medical is anyone's guess, but after coming on as sub at West Ham for his debut, he took something of a hospital pass from future best mate Ian Ashby and felt some studs grind down his knee, rendering him injured for an impossibly long time while on a ludicrously high wage for a criminally long time paid by a club that didn't, it turned out, have any actual money. How quickly things can change. After a year of rumor and innuendo about his off-field antics while injured, Bullard finally came back a year later and was still obviously a very gifted footballer. But a second knee injury, albeit to a different knee, put him out of action again towards the end of 2009-10, and by the time he was in any shape to return, City had been relegated and his great defender, Phil Brown, had been replaced by Nigel Pearson. Bullard had his moments in the Championship. A winner in the last minutes at Sheffield United won't be forgotten in any hurry, but his wages, his refusal to accept similar terms elsewhere as a poverty-stricken City desperately tried to get shut of an increasingly poisonous figure, and his generally unprofessional conduct while injured meant that when he finally left after a clash with goalkeeping coach Joe Corrigan, which allowed City to dismiss him on gross misconduct, uncompensated, it was a blessed relief. He remains utterly reviled. 4. Dame Ndoye. Senegalese striker signed for £3 million on the last day of the 2015 deadline from Lokomotiv Moscow, where he had been a reliable goalscorer. Transition to the Premier League, and in an ailing side, seemed quite straightforward at first, as he scored in his first 3 home games as City beat Aston Villa and QPR, and drew with Sunderland. The inconsistency of the side then enveloped that of the player, although he plundered 2 excellent second-half goals to earn City a win at Crystal Palace that seemed set to aid the Tigers towards safety, especially as it was followed by a home win over Liverpool in which Ndoye excelled at leading the line. It all came down to what is now an infamous relegation 6-pointer against Burnley, and Ndoye's off day was replicated by the side whose defeat sounded the death knell after 2 eventful seasons. Ndoye joined Trabzonspor in the summer for £2.2 million as the Alums began the now familiar post-demotion task of selling off anyone that another club waves to, although he was soon back in England with a loan spell at Sunderland. He's still at Trabzonspor today as a backup striker. 5. James Chester. Often the transfer window can be dominated by the acquisition of perceived glamour players or the departure of club legends. City, a club learning to like itself again in 2010-11 under Nigel Pearson, did a bit of both during the January window when Matty Friat signed for £1.2 million while Ian Ashby called time on his 9 years of illustrious service and leadership by going to Preston on a free. Within all this, Pearson had the Manchester United training ground on speed dial and brought in a stack of players from Old Trafford of enormous promise but not quite deemed good enough to make the final big step. There was a winger, an industrious midfielder, a left-back and a central defender, and it was the defender who was most obviously a class act from the start. Chester was skillful, positionally sound and an excellent reader of the game, as well as consummate in the defenders. Art of tackling, one of the cleanest tacklers we've ever seen, and aerial domination, despite not being the tallest. Rarely did he put a foot wrong during an illustrious, hugely popular City career that allowed him to develop his game alongside the experienced Jack Hobbs, before Steve Bruce arrived and rejigged the entire squad, but without any detriment to the elegant defender he'd inherited. Chester was a star in the Premier League despite being something of a lesser name alongside the likes of Huddleston, Livermore, Jelavic Al, and his reputation rose so high that talk of him being picked for England began just before he decided to take up an offer to play for Wales. He scored in the FA Cup final, of course, which was all the more remarkable because injuries suggested that he had absolutely no right to be partaking at Wembley at all, and continued to impress and do a quietly efficient job, even though his City career ultimately ended in relegation in 2015. Chester went to West Brom for big, but not big enough, money and barely played in his favoured position, instead featuring as a left-back under Tony Pulis, who quickly sold him after a season to Aston Villa following their own relegation. He is currently captaining the Villa side under Bruce, who knows how lucky he has been to have inherited a very special player twice over. Unquestionably a bargain purchase and one of our greatest ever defenders.